In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate the while loop in Python. Now, we have been working with the if, then, else statements, for instance. Here, I'm going to introduce the while statement, or the while loop. In other words, Python is going to reiterate until the condition becomes true. First, a word on compound statements. A compound statement, as we saw earlier, contains a group of other statements. In other words, it's a block of code and they affect or control the execution of those other statements in one way or the other. In general, compound statements can span multiple lines of code, although in simple incarnations, a whole compound statement may be contained in one line as well. So the while statement in Python is its most general iteration construct. What it does, it repeatedly executes a block of indented statements as long as a test at the top keeps evaluating to a true value. So in other words, you specify a condition, and as long as that condition is met, Python is going to keep executing and run a loop. When the test becomes false, in other words, when and only the test becomes false, the control continues after all the statements in the while loop are executed and the conditions are met, and the body never runs if the test is false to begin with. In other words, when we create a while statement, Python is going to look at the code, it's going to keep running the code as long as the values are true within your code, and only if the value becomes false, nothing's going to happen unless you specify otherwise. So here's an example. For instance, if I were to say something like while, this is the syntax, while 1 colon, Python would indent the code, print, type Control-C to stop me, something like that, or any text. Let's see what happens when we in fact type this. The first just prints a message forever by nesting a print statement in the while loop. Recall that an integer 1 means true. So 0 is false, 1 is true. Since the test is always true, in other words, it's just 1, Python is going to keep executing the body forever or until you stop its execution. And this is typically called the infinite loop. In other words, it's a never-ending loop. Python is going to keep printing, type Control-C to stop me, and it's going to continue forever, ever, and ever, until of course you use a break statement, for instance, in your code, or you turn your computer off. But Python is not going to stop. Let me in fact demonstrate. So let's click on File, New File to bring up our editor. Let me move this aside. Perfect. So here I'm going to say a comment. This is how an infinite loop works. So I'm going to say something like, let's say while 1 colon, simply print something like you cannot stop this. Let's see what happens when I run this simple module. Click run module, click OK to save. And this brings up our Windows Explorer. I'm going to navigate to my Python folder here and give this module a name, something like while1, click save, and Python is going to execute this while loop and is going to continue to execute. Notice it's just printing new lines and lines and lines, because all you did was specify while1, which is true, print, you cannot stop this. So this is an infinite loop in Python. And of course I can use the break statement. So for instance, the next line I use my break statement. Python is going to break the statement right here if I run this again. So let's run module, click OK, and Python now simply says you cannot stop this once, because right after I print the output, I told Python to break the while loop. All right, great. Let me do another example here. So here, for instance, let's say I like to specify the number of times I like Python to loop around as long as the statement is true. So let me start over and delete this. I'm going to run another or create another code here, for instance, and I'm going to say something like, let's say count equals 0, specify a variable here, and then use my while statements. So while count, let's say, is less than 10, and of course I'm going to use my colon, otherwise Python is not going to indent this. And then I'm going to tell Python to print, and I'm going to say something like, hello, I am a while, and count is the variable again, count, close the parentheses. And here I'm going to tell Python to count plus equals 1. We've used this before. Recall it's just like saying n equal n plus 1, right? So iterate as long as it's less than 10. And if I run this module, click run module, click OK to save. And in this instance, Python prints the output 10 times, 0 through 9. Hello, I'm a while, and the count is 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9, because this is what I specified. So let me minimize this for now. So here, just a simple concept of while statement. As long as all the conditions are true, Python is going to keep looping around until you specify or you stop the execution. Here's more examples. So I demonstrated a couple of examples. For instance, count equals 0, while less than 10. We just took a look at this. In fact, it printed hello, I'm a while, and the count is count plus equals 1. Now when using the following code, we print the 9 sentences, and the less than is not the same as less than or equal to, and always remember to actualize the count. If not, you get an infinite loop. And creating a loop that prints out all the numbers from 1 to 10 squared, for instance, each on their own line. So we can also create a loop based on our own requirements. Let me do a couple of more examples. So let me bring up our editor here. Here we go. Let me get rid of this. Okay. Let's do something like, so I'm going to start off with a comment here, for instance. I'm going to say something like, the following script calculates the sum of the numbers from 1 to, let's say, 100. Okay, perfect. So just a standard comment. The reason why I broke this into 2 number sign comments, so it doesn't span the entire line, so it's easier for us to see. Okay, great. So now I need to define a couple of variables here. So I can say something like n, my first number is, well, all the way up to 100 because I like the 100 count. And then use the sum equals 0. Next, I'm going to specify a counter because it's going to start calculating the sum, right? So I'm going to say something like counter equals 1. And then I'm going to use my while loop because this is where you would, in essence, use a while loop because it's going to loop around until all the calculations are made and it calculates the sum of the numbers from 1 to 100. Otherwise, it's not possible with the if statement. It's going to take you a long time by writing each line and so forth. Okay. So while counter is, let's say, less than or equal to n, and n is my 100, right? That's the variable. Here's my colon. Python should add, right? So Python should do sum equals sum plus my counter, right? Okay, see how I'm using my variables and telling Python follow the logic here, right? In other words, keep looping around as long as the counter is less than or equal to 100. And counter in this instance is 1, right? So it's between 1 and 100. So from 1 to 100. And that's exactly what I created so far. So once it's done looping around, what's it going to do? It's going to do sum equals sum which is 0 plus the counter plus 1. So it's going to do 0 plus 1, 0 plus 2, and so forth. It's going to keep doing this like 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, all the way up to 100 and do all the combinations. So once I've specified the sum equals sum plus counter, next I'm going to say counter plus equals 1, which is again same as x or n equals n plus 1, or x equals n plus 1, right? Add 1 to it. And once I'm done, I can say print the output, right? So I'm going to say print sum of 1 until, let's say, percent d colon and percent d, and then use the percent one more time, and of course my variables, which is n and sum, and close my parentheses. Let's see what happens when I run this simple script that I created using the while statement. So click run module, click OK to save, and Python displays the output and gives me the sum of 1 until 100 is 5,050. So I hope you get the idea so far. Let me do one last example here just to reinforce some of the learning concept here. So I'm going to delete this for now, and I'm going to say create another script here. So let's say sum from 1 to the let's say given upper bound, right? So we understand further. Upper bound, and here I'm going to define my variable, which is like n, and this is going to be an integer, and I'm going to ask the user for input. So input, and I'm going to say enter the upper bound, close my couple of parentheses. Next, I'm going to say I equals 1, just another variable here, and then sum equals 0. Then I'm going to use my while loop. I'm going to tell Python to start the iteration. So while, I'm going to say I is less than or equal to n. Okay, put my colon. What should Python do? It should sum plus equals I, and of course I plus equals 1. Print the output. Simply in this instance I'm going to say print sum, and of course the p is lowercase, print sum. Perfect. So here, just another simple example of using the while loop. Let's click on run module, click OK. In this instance, Python first asks me enter the upper bound. So if I enter something like 5, Python says it's 15. Okay, so this way you can work with the while statement. It's a very powerful statement in Python, especially if you're using with other conditional statements like if, else, elif, and then of course our while loop. So I hope this helps. Practice, and let's move to our next lesson.